The Honourable Adam Searle.
Mr Deputy President, I move private member's business number item 881 regarding a referral to the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Mr Deputy President, this matter is serious and pressing and highlights a growing scandal and crisis at the highest levels of the Berejiklian government, engulfing the Premier and her office. It involves the evidence that she gave to the Independent Commission Against Corruption and other matters that have come to light since. And these are very serious matters. The motion before the House is lengthy, and paragraph 1 sets out the summary of it, and I will take members to the substance of the motion. But the reason why it is so complete is to highlight to honourable members that this is not a frivolous or lightly done matter. It's a matter of substance, and we have tried to assemble there all the facts that are in the public domain in support of the Independent Commission Against Corruption looking at these matters, looking at them closely and evaluating them. Individually, they are serious. Taken together, they represent a compelling case that the current Premier should certainly be investigated by the corruption watchdog. We know she was a witness in an ICAC hearing. We don't know what other matters the ICAC may be examining, but there is a facility for this Parliament to refer a matter to the ICAC and compel it to look at these matters. Even were it just this House, that is a serious matter that the Independent Commission Against Corruption would have to seriously consider and evaluate in the public interest. Paragraph 1 sets out the summary. There's the issue, the fundamental issue of what the Premier knew about the former Liberal MP for Wagga Wagga, Daryl Maguire's business dealings. It doesn't really matter how she knew or why she knew, but she knew about these matters. She knew about these matters, and and the Premier's defence was essentially to belittle Mr Maguire, to effectively describe him as some Walter Mitty character, fanciful. But that doesn't explain the text messages passing between them when he gets the $5,000 commission. And it certainly doesn't explain the circumstances leading up to and surrounding his resignation from Parliament. And that's the tipping point, Mr Deputy President, because at that point the Premier knows beyond any shred of a doubt that what Mr Maguire is up to, seeking to charge developers commissions, to line his own pockets, to pay off his debts and provide for his life post-politics, and to make money out of developers doing business with the state government. The government headed up by Ms Berejiklian herself. A very grave matter. A very grave matter. At that point, she knows, if she didn't before, that it's real and that it's publicly unacceptable. And in fact, she had to concede it was so publicly unacceptable that he couldn't remain the whip, couldn't remain a member of the Liberal Party, couldn't remain in the Parliament. Couldn't remain in the Parliament, had to go. Tipping Wagga Wagga into a by-election which saw the election of Dr Joe McGurr. And even if she had thought in her heart of hearts that he did nothing wrong, she knew it was not publicly acceptable. She knew then about the $5,000 commission he'd already earned, and she knew then about other matters that they had spoken of. And even if that time she had no further details, and even if that time she didn't, at the time he told her she didn't think it was real, she was on notice from the date of his resignation that these matters were grave and important. And she then had a compelling legal obligation, not a moral obligation, although that was present, but a legal obligation under Section 11, subsection 2 of the ICAC Act to tell the ICAC what she knew. She obviously weighed it up, and she made a conscious and knowing decision to conceal it. And she did that to preserve her premiership, her leadership of her political party, and to preserve her government then only a few months from facing a re-election. These are all grave matters that warrant investigation. The next matter, of course, is the nature of that relationship. She describes it as a close personal relationship. It was a matter where they wanted to make their relationship public. It's a matter where, in her own version, that marriage was contemplated. But then on the other hand, it wasn't of sufficient status to warrant disclosure. Why is that distinction important? Because under the Ministerial Code, an intimate personal relationship must be disclosed, and the interests of a family member, including a person with whom you're in an intimate personal relationship, must also be disclosed. That is, she would have been under a lawful obligation under the Ministerial Code to disclose what she knew of Mr Maguire's business dealings. And so, in a way that can only be described as a tortured reasoning, she constructs this notion of close personal relationship as distinct from an intimate personal relationship. And truly, on the face of it, she's fencing with words. She's fencing with words, and these matters need to be investigated because it doesn't pass the pub test. There's clearly a conflict of interest here, in our view, and this matter should also be investigated by the ICAC. There's her denial that she knew Mr Iwan Sunito, the Crown Group Chairman and Group CEO, a major property developer, despite evidence that that is not the case. There's the issue of Mr Maguire griping about his difficulties with the Greater Sydney Commission, about how it's getting in his way. And then lo and behold, the Premier moves it out of the portfolio of the Planning Minister into her own portfolio. Contrary to the advice of senior public servants who listed comprehensively all the good, sensible, objective public policy reasons why she ought not do so. And yet, for reasons not disclosed even today, she persisted in that move. And the only inference on the basis of the public information is she did it to assist Mr Maguire. No other explanation has been forthcoming from the Premier or her government. And then we have the role of the Premier in the approval of the Stronger Communities Fund tied grants. There's the destruction of the physical working advice notes that went into the Premier's office upon which she wrote. And so we have, under a shroud of secrecy, how the Premier, the head of the executive government, personally decided to allocate nearly $142 million of public money without an open application process. No one knew they could apply for this money. Communities right across the state missed out on an opportunity of saying, hey, we need this. There's a great opportunity in our community. There's a compelling project that requires support. Listen to us. But no, in the secrecy of her personal office, she makes a decision to allocate $142 million of public money. No selection process, no assessment process. We don't know what was on the bit of paper because it was shredded. And of course, this government tells us in this House, time after number, there are no documents, there were no documents. Well, there were no documents because you shredded them. What a disgrace. Then the government tried to cloak in further secrecy the electronic footprint by deleting the documents. Now that's a matter that this House has expressed a view on earlier this week, and no doubt we will see what we see on Monday about these matters. But we need to know, and we should have investigated, the role of the Premier in causing her office to do these things. All of these things need to be looked at carefully and closely. As I said, taken individually, each of these matters, I believe, warrants close scrutiny. Not just by the public, not just by this Parliament, but by the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Taken together, they make a compelling case. A compelling case that this Premier should depart office, but even prior to that, a compelling case that the ICAC should, of course, look into these matters. And, of course, we know the funding of the ICAC is a perennial issue. We know that the Public Accountability Committee has expressed views on bodies, including the ICAC, but also performing other oversight roles of government, should be independently funded, not through the will of the Treasury expressed in a majority vote by the governing party. And we know that this is also the view of the Auditor-General. And yet this government keeps the ICAC on the drip feed. Keeps the ICAC on the drip feed, putting ICAC in this very difficult position when it has to investigate the governing party. If ever there was a good and clear example of the need for an independent funding model for ICAC, this is it. But notwithstanding that, we would urge upon the ICAC a close and thorough investigation of these matters. Mr Deputy President, paragraph 4 sets out the facts of the Premier's public office holding. Paragraph 5 sets out the legal framework, including the relevant provisions of the ICAC Act and the Premier's memorandum relating to the Code of Ministerial Conduct and, of course, the Ministerial Code of Conduct. Paragraph 6 sets out the issue of a family member, and section 7, the conflict of interest provisions, and makes it quite clear why we say it is that, in fact, on the face of the information we have, it is more than arguable that the Premier and Mr Maguire were in an intimate personal relationship requiring disclosure of his business dealings by her at the relevant time, which she had failed to do, and sets out there her conflicting evidence, both at the ICAC and in the public domain, about what she regards as the status of that relationship, showing quite clearly the confusion in her version, giving rise to an inescapable conclusion that she's just not being frank with the public or the Parliament. This requires investigation by the ICAC. In relation to what she knew and ought to have disclosed, if you look at paragraph 7, there's the $5,000 commission, proving that at least on some occasions Mr Maguire did bring off his schemes and secured payment for them from developers. At paragraph 7C, we see his debt levels that he wishes to have paid off, giving him clear motivation, and she is, of course, aware of that. In fact, paragraph C, she is quoted from the ICAC transcript of saying, "Yeah, I know that." In paragraph E, he tells her about the Badgerys Creek stuff, making enough money to pay off his debts. Can you believe it, in one sale? And she replies, "I can believe it." Well, Mr Deputy President, we can believe it too. We can believe that this guy was involved in scam after scam. She knew about it. She approved it. What did she say when he gets the $5,000 payoff? Woo-hoo, quote unquote. Approving, encouraging. And of course, despite her best effort, if this was a person she was in a, on her version, close personal relationship that she thought she might marry, the relationship she wanted to make public, his financial security and well-being was, of course, on any view, a matter of relevance to her. She says it never crossed her mind, but that is simply not a believable proposition. And even if it didn't cross her mind, if you look at it from the public's point of view, it gives rise to at least an appearance of a conflict of interest which needed to be addressed by her. Small wonder, given this messy state of affairs, she didn't properly superintend the disclosures of her other ministers or parliamentary secretaries, including fabled Minister Sidoti, a minister who has been under investigation longer than he's actually was on duty as a minister, over 12 months.
This is starting to get a little bit far from the...
I understand. I'm just making the point. You can see her superintendence of those in her charge, and it's, of course, to ask the question, how does she let it get into that mess? Well, her own affairs were, of course, not being properly attended to in the way required by the law, as set out in the motion, Mr Deputy President, the substantive motion, we are debating here. Paragraph G, we see Mr Maguire talking about counting his tax return, his clear financial motivation to engage in these desperate dealings, these shady dealings with developers to line his own pocket. Of course she had an interest in his financial security and well-being, given their close connection and what, on her view, they had both hoped for the future. It required disclosure by her, it required transparency by her. She should have done so and she failed to do so. But it wasn't just a failure. She's a smart woman, the Premier. She knew her obligations. She made a conscious decision to not attend to these matters because she knew, particularly when he disappeared in a puff of scandal in July, August 2018, she knew to disclose would be the end of her leadership of her party, of the government, and possibly the end of the government. If the public of New South Wales had known in March 2019 about these matters, they might have drawn a different conclusion about her record as Premier. She had a clear motivation to lie, to hide the truth, and these matters should need to, having been brought into the light in this way, require the ICAC to have a look at. Paragraph 8, she knows Mr Iwan Sunito. And of course, the following page, paragraph I, the matter that Mr Maguire got pinged at during Operation Dasha, the investigation by ICAC into Canterbury Bankstown Council, it was the Chinese garden matter. And then, of course, fast forward to this year, that is one of the taps that it was played between the Premier and Mr Maguire, was about him telling her about that very scam that he was trying to pull. So she knew, and then, of course, when it came into ICAC in 2018, she already knew. And did she disclose to the public? Did she disclose to the Secretary of Premier and Cabinet? Did she disclose to her own Cabinet colleagues? She did not. Such comprehensive breaches of trust at the highest level of this government, but also legal breaches, breaches of the law, breaches of her ethical and legal obligations, requiring and demanding an investigation. Paragraph 7 deals with the Mr Sunito matter. Paragraph 8 deals with the Badgerys Creek matter, leading, of course, into the reshuffle of the Greater Sydney Commission from the Planning Minister's purview into her own. And it's quite clear, given the frustrations that Mr Maguire had experienced with the Greater Sydney Commission, how they were getting in his way, the only inference you can draw, contrary to advice, good sense, what have you, that the move by the Premier can only have been actuated by trying to assist Mr Maguire, because no other explanation has been forthcoming from the government. And then, of course, paragraph 9, we've got the grants matter set out in great length. And, of course, it's not just this side of the House or other commentators who say this scandalous, skewed allocation of $142 million of public money, 95% of which went to electorates that had voted for the coalition in the past. It's not only us who says that does not pass the pub test. The former Auditor-General Tony Harris has said that the role of the Premier's office, including in the shredding of the documents, is good reason for her departure. She should resign. It's just not sustainable that we can have this kind of behaviour at the highest levels of government. And of course, contemporaneous email records indicate that the Premier variously signed off or approved the councillors receiving their projects, although she says, I made no decisions. It was just simply she was comfortable with this. It was the Office of Local Government who made the decision. But of course, the Office of Local Government made it very clear in its evidence to the Public Accountability Committee that it was acting under the direction of the Premier having made the decision. And it's the shredding of the documents that tells you that there was something worth covering up, because no one shreds documents like that. Ms Cruikshank's evidence to the inquiry, the then Chief of Staff to the Premier, made it very clear that this was not or should not be standard practice in that office. And it was Ms Cruikshank's evidence, I think, that it wasn't standard practice, that it didn't happen regularly. And so the fact that it happened on this occasion really focuses attention on what was written on that paper and what is in that deleted Word document. These matters need to be investigated. And of course, the ICAC has warned in its submission to the Public Accountability Committee that if the Minister is not the appointed decision maker, directing or urging a public servant to make a decision preferred by the Minister, in this case the Premier, may amount to corrupt conduct. And Mr Deputy President, that is exactly what has happened here. The Premier's office has developed a list, it's gone into the Premier, she's expressed her views. The email has gone from Ms Lau to OLG, and OLG has done as it was expected to do.
Order. The member's time has expired.
Mr Deputy President, I urge honourable members to support this motion.
Your member's time has expired.